The Doris Bither case by guest author October 14, 2022.
Guest article by Berk, Gümüs.
Doris Bither's story is possibly one of the most fascinating and well-documented accounts on what the human consciousness, respectively the mental block, can do if it gets out of control. She not only thought that she was repeatedly plagued by 3 poltergeists that raped her on several occasions, she was unknowingly doing it to herself with her own mental powers, which is called psychoautokinesis, that were witnessed by doctoral researchers from the University of California. They saw Doris attacked by an invisible force that punched and slapped her, threw her against a wall, as if phantom hands was grabbing her. Psychoautokinesis is based on the phenomenon whereby humans who suffer from a specific psychophysical form, respectively possession, physically injure themselves as a result of their own mental powers and can even sexually rape themselves in this way, and is not to be confused with psychoautopirokinesis, the term for the mentally triggered process of self-burning, where a person can turn to ashes. See Contact Report 236. But she also generated bright greenish-yellow balls of light, so-called orbs. Others say it was kind of a green mist that at one point came together and formed the upper torso of a man appearing near Doris and moving as a human would move, causing one investigator to faint, which is called psychoteleplasty. At the time, there were about 24 people in the room who all witnessed the same thing. Teleplasty is the conscious generation of shadowy forms and projections by means of the block of mentality's power. With this, however, if the human psyche, in cooperation with the entirety of the mental powers, is the actual trigger of the phenomena, then the projections are completely unconsciously evoked. In this case it then deals with an apparition in the form of psychoteleplasty. However, this phenomenon has, in no way, anything to do with a materialization of ghosts/spirits, as these materialization phenomena are interpreted and explained by spiritualism. Actually, with that, it therefore does not deal with so-called ectoplasm apparitions, respectively, teleplasma apparitions, from which the term teleplasty has recently appeared. If these materialization phenomena are unconsciously evoked as a result of certain damaged states of the psyche, then it is psychoteleplasty. Therefore, none of that, neither in one form nor the other, has anything to do with the so-called ectoplasm apparitions of spiritualism. She also generated psychotelekinesis. She made pots and pans fly across the room as if it was thrown by someone. Her children were pushed and on occasion thrown. Psycho, this term, as it is used in words such as psychoteleportation, psychotelekinesis or psychoteleplasty, and so forth, means that the pertinent phenomenon is triggered in a completely unconscious manner, solely as a result of a psyche's damaged state, and emerges from it. Consequently, the human therefore has no knowledge that he suffers from psychic problems, and, as a result of that, triggers the phenomenon via his psyche and his block of mentality, respectively, as a result of its mental fluidal powers. In contrast to that is the completely conscious form, such as, for example, telepathy, teleportation and telekinesis, and so forth, in which the term psycho is not a prefix. That means that the aforementioned forms are completely consciously and volitionally engendered as a result of the mental fluidal powers, respectively, as a result of the block of mentality and its electromagnetic oscillations and its powers. Consequently, the phenomena are therefore consciously engendered, regulated and controlled. Psychoautokinesis relates to such movements when it deals with a considerable distance over which a human, living at the given time, consciously, at that time, moves a material object by way of his mental powers alone. To put it in very simplified terms, Doris Bither was something like an unconscious entity who could not control her tremendous mental powers, so they all acted against her. But let's start from the beginning. In August of 1974, Dr. Barry Taff, a doctor in psychophysiology, a biomedical engineer, and a world-renowned parapsychologist, Kerry Gaynor, was discussing issues related to his latest case with an associate while browsing books at the local bookstore. Doris Bither overheard the conversation and approached Dr. Taff, telling him that her house was haunted and she needed help. He agreed to investigate and at the time thought it to be another standard case no different than his hundreds of other reports. Arriving at Doris' home at 11,547 Braddock Drive, Dr. Taff noted that the home was in a state of squalor. Doris was a single mother living with her adolescent daughter and her 3 sons. In his initial discussions with Doris, Dr. Taff reported that she was the victim of an abusive childhood and to that day was demonstrating symptoms of a deep psychological trauma. Doris grew up as a child of alcoholics in an abusive home. Eventually she was disowned by her family after a series of altercations. She had a number of failed and abusive relationships. All 4 of her children had different fathers. Her sons report the family had always experienced some minor level of telekinetic activity, even before moving to Culver City. Although he didn't immediately dismiss the case, these discoveries added to his skepticism and possibly heightened the degree of investigation. The children first told Dr. Taff about the entity they called Gümüs, which all 4 had claimed to witness on numerous occasions. He noted that their depictions were remarkably accurate, not just matching each other's, but also in details commonly attributed to entities from his other cases. In 2009, Ghost Theory conducted an interview with Doris' middle son, Brian Harris, who stated, "We all experienced some form of attack. There was the pushing, biting and scratching being done to us. There were about 4 entities in the home, and they made themselves known by appearing all the time. I think it took a lot of energy for them to do that." He described the entities as follows: "It was always like a fog. Like a human but not quite." During one incident, Brian, who was in his early teens at the time, attempted to intervene in his mother's attack and was thrown across the room. Doris described her attacks, saying that there were in fact 3 entities. 2 smaller ones that would hold her down while the 3rd larger entity raped her. These attacks left marks on Doris' body indicative of a rape, including bruises on her inner thighs and throat. The combined testimony of the family convinced Dr. Taff to establish a base for the monitoring of the paranormal phenomenon in the house. He brought in specialized lighting, cameras, and audio recording equipment, as well as a team of colleagues from UCLA. On their first formal investigation of the entity plaguing Doris Bither, Dr. Taff requested that she attempt an appearance by provoking the beings, which she did. The results were astounding. They captured strange noises and seen objects that fell without human mediation and other manifestations. Lights appeared to shoot through the room, marching in meter. Many were caught on film, and all of this was witnessed by the 20-something researchers present. From that moment began a constant crowded investigation in which some 30 people from the field of parapsychology were involved. The most mysterious moment was when several of the witnesses saw the presence of a figure that appeared to be a man, which was referred to as the entity. This figure appeared in the middle of kind of a green mist. This entity was faceless and was shown from the torso up. The physique seemed to be stocky. The research team brought in Geiger counters to measure radiation. When no activity was happening, the counters showed normal levels of background radiation. When the activity was occurring, there wasn't even any measurable background radiation that registered. Dr. Taff observed that Doris was a heavy drinker. However, when she stopped drinking, the phenomena also stopped. They noticed the activity was always at its most intense when Doris was in the house. In a laboratory, where she stayed for testing purposes, attempts were made to capture the forces in order to be able to bind and destroy them, but this failed thoroughly. The forces of the mental block could actually be captured by a nitrogen block and made visible as a ghostly apparition, but the enormous mental powers and by the demolished psyche-controlled forces of the woman brought the nitrogen block, so to speak, to the explosion and atomized this properly. After several weeks, Doris Bither and her children moved into a new house in Carson, California. Within a few weeks of moving in, activity began occurring in the new house, as well as in the houses of both of the family's next-door neighbors. Taff and Gaynor witnessed activity in the new home as well. A vase appeared to be thrown and crashed to the floor. Deep breathing and footsteps appeared on audio recordings approaching the microphone until the mic shut off on its own. Tape on the wall was pulled off by invisible hands, and then the board it was holding flew off and hit Bither in the head. This happened twice within minutes. Doris Bither moved to San Bernardino and then to Texas without telling Taff and Gaynor. Eventually, they lost touch with her completely, and they didn't investigate any of her homes further. However, Doris maintained contact with author Frank D. Filita, and she reported to him that no matter where she moved, the activity followed her. In the end, the attacks stopped and she was able to finally catch herself again after several years of hell, through good psychological and psychiatric care. According to Brian Harris, Doris' middle son who was 13 years old in 1974, Doris Bither died of pulmonary failure in 1995.
The Entity book and movie.
In the book, about fluidal energy respectively fluidal powers and other things, questions and answers from Billy Edward Albert Meyer, reports in detail on the Doris Bither case as follows: page 181 to 186 unofficial translation.
The rule is that deposited mental fluidic forces are stationary. They are also not dangerous or aggressive because they are in no way coarse material, that is to say not coarse material. There are individual cases in which such mental forces follow, so to speak, through their own psychic block and subconscious block, the person whom they attack. However, this is based on the fact that the person in question, through the forces of his or her thoughts and feelings, his or her psyche, his or her consciousness, his or her unconsciousness and his or her subconsciousness, forms his or her mental fluidic forces or his or her mental block in such a way that he or she is caught by it and is in bondage to the whole. The whole thing is a combination of psychokinetic and psychophysical as well as psychosomatic factors by which the human being hacks, harasses and maltreats himself or herself. In Texas, for example, there was a case in which a woman was raped invisibly for observers for years, at times practically every day and every night, also under the eyes of the scientists, her boyfriend and her child. She was beaten green and blue and bore welts and wounds. She then moved about 300 kilometers away to a place where she still lives today. This then weakened everything. However, the fact that the incidents diminished was solely due to the fact that the woman felt safer in the new place and consequently her mental state calmed down a bit, which made the occurrences less frequent. Such occurrences are not that frequent, but they do happen sometimes. The case was shown on television. However, in all the occurrences not some deposited mental fluidal forces of another person played a role, but the demolished state of consciousness and psychic state of the woman, as well as her own thoughts, feelings and her consciousness and subconsciousness forces themselves, whereby she triggered everything herself. In the end, she was really able to finally catch herself again, but she was completely disturbed. Through good psychological and psychiatric care, she finally found herself again after several years. Today it no longer happens that she is attacked, and it is clear that everything from her demolished state of consciousness and psyche was caused via her mental fluidic powers, that is to say by her mental block. In a laboratory where she stayed for testing purposes, attempts were made to capture the forces in order to be able to bind and destroy them, but this failed thoroughly. The forces of the mental block could actually be captured by a nitrogen block and made visible as a ghostly apparition, but the enormous mental powers and by the demolished psyche-controlled forces of the woman brought the nitrogen block, so to speak, to the explosion and atomized this properly. This was actually captured on a film, because there are several possibilities in this regard. One is that the subconscious block of the woman in question reacted in this way from retrieved impulses from the memory banks or from some dreams. Another possibility is that it happened through the influence of a malicious human being who quite consciously triggered the whole thing out of hatred and pathological craving for revenge through psychical mobbing and so on. But it is also possible that the woman fell into the consciousness and psychic degeneration out of purely personal incapacity in relation to life or in relation to an experience and so on that she could not cope with. These possibilities, among others, must be taken into consideration. So, the effective truth of what happened is that the woman in any case triggered and caused the whole thing by her demolished consciousness and by her demolished psyche, and therefore by her own mental block, by her thoughts and feelings, as well as by her consciousness, its unconsciousness, the psyche, and the subconsciousness, and therefore by her mental fluidal forces. Question: the atomating, which was mentioned earlier in connection with the woman, how does that work? The question refers to the exploded carbon dioxide block in relation to the woman in the United States of America who harmed, maltreated, injured and raped herself psychophysically. This happened because the woman's mental powers became too powerful. This caused the carbon dioxide block, the carbon dioxide, to explode, the pure mental forces.
What happened then?
In the mentioned carbon dioxide block in the laboratory, a ghostly apparition appeared during a parapsychological experiment, because the woman had concentrated on it. As a result, the ghostly apparition appeared in the carbon dioxide block, which had been triggered by her psycho-damaged mental energies and powers. It was a diffuse, shadowy being that finally really blew apart the carbon dioxide block. It exploded into 1,000 pieces.
Did she produce this herself?
The woman did it herself in her psychical mental delusion by which she was dominated. It was a psychical consciousness-based mental delusion.
This being who raped the woman was also only a delusion.
This being was only a delusion that she created in a schizophrenic delusion. The delusion was thereby so enormous that psychokinetic forces of great magnitude were unleashed, by which then the woman was also raped, by herself, triggered by the energies and forces of her own delusion. And further on page 265 the following is reported about the Doris Bither case.
It was once told of such a case that the fluidic forces wandered from one place to another.
There is a misunderstanding. The case happened in America, where a woman lived who was said to have been haunted and abused by fluidal forces and an evil spirit, which is of course nonsense. She settled about 300 kilometers away, but there everything appeared exactly the same, but in a very much diminished form. The fact and truth is that the woman was so psychologically disturbed that she was psychophysically self-harming, raping and beating herself, and so on, believing that the attacks on her would stop if she changed her place of residence and moved a few hundred kilometers away, changed only so far that everything diminished and attacks became rare. Through a significant psychiatric treatment and healing of the psyche and consciousness, everything that the woman had suffered for years finally disappeared.
Was this filmed?
It was filmed, yes.